Be quiet, Lydia. That would be better for everyone. The sentence landed in the middle of what seemed like a very peaceful family dinner. It was just a short sentence, but enough to make the entire room fall silent. Lydia quietly pulled her chair a little closer to the table. It was the kind of action that older people recognize immediately, the way someone makes themselves smaller so everything can still look fine. In that moment, a familiar fear crept in slowly. The fear of being excluded from decisions after getting too used to being the good one. If she stayed quiet long enough, would there come a day when no one asked her anymore? And that is the story of Lydia Monroe. There are families that look very peaceful because only one person always knows when to stay silent. If you have ever believed that silence is a form of love, a way to keep the peace, to keep a home warm, then maybe this video is for you. Before the story continues, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is where you live right now. Stories like this tend to arrive at night, when the house has gone quiet and people can finally hear the things they missed all day. If this touches something in you, stay until the end. This video was created with the help of AI and edited by a human to offer reflection and educational perspective. It is not meant to encourage imitation, only to walk with you through a long night. I'm Lydia. I grew up in a very typical American suburban family. White fences, neatly cut lawns, dinners served on time. I was the child who never caused trouble, the one who cleared the table early, who remembered to buy more bread when it ran out, who nodded before a question was even fully asked. I used to believe that silence meant maturity, that stepping back was wisdom, that if I didn't make things harder, everyone would feel lighter. I got used to stepping aside. So used to it that I didn't realize I had stepped aside from my own voice, until that sentence was spoken, not harsh, not loud, just clear enough for me to understand that my silence had become the default, like the chair I had just pulled closer to the table, always there, in the right place without needing to be asked. That night wasn't the first time I had been excluded from a decision. It was just the first time it was said out loud. I was always called the one who was fine. Not the kind of fine that stands out or gets praised, but the kind that reassures everyone that no trouble will arise. I was the one asked to watch the house when everyone was away, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, the one who stood up to make more coffee when the conversation began to sag. My family relied on me to keep the peace in a very natural way, as if it were a built-in function. I got used to that too. So used to it that I no longer knew where choice ended and reflex began. At gatherings, when the conversation started to drift or showed signs of tension, someone would look at me first. Just a glance. I understood. I changed the subject, or smiled lightly, or nodded and let it pass. No one said anything, but everyone breathed easier. I thought that was my role. I thought I was helping. Once, in the middle of a crowded lunch, when a decision had just been made rather quickly, I gently opened my mouth to ask one more question. Before I could finish, someone laughed and said, half joking, "Lydia always understands anyway." The whole table laughed. I laughed too. The smile came so fast I didn't have time to think. It was a familiar reflex, smiling to keep the rhythm, smiling to let everything move on. But the moment that smile reached my lips, I felt something sink ever so slightly in my chest, as if I had just missed a breath. I sat with that sentence longer than I expected. What does understands mean when it is always used to end a question? Does it mean don't ask anymore? Or does it mean understanding that your question doesn't matter? I began to realize how rarely I was truly asked. Not polite questions, "What do you think?" but questions that actually leave space for an answer to exist. The exhaustion arrived quietly. It didn't make me irritable or openly sad. It felt like standing too long in a sealed room, the air thinning without anyone noticing. I still kept everything running smoothly. I was still fine. But sometimes, after washing the dishes and standing there looking at the empty sink, I wondered whether this calm needed me as a person, or only the silence I carried with me. A few days after that dinner, an important family decision was made without me in the room. I didn't find out because someone told me directly, but because I heard it mentioned again as a finished detail. The voice was even, the words familiar, the plan laid out neatly as if it had been carefully considered. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, my hands still wet from washing the last glass, and the first feeling that rose up wasn't surprise. It was a small, sharp sting right in the center of my chest. I felt angry. Not loud anger, but a compressed heat, mixed with hurt. I was about to speak. Just one sentence, maybe a very gentle question. I opened my mouth, then stopped. In that instant, I could hear my own heartbeat more clearly than the conversation in the living room. I thought about the looks that would turn toward me, about the way the air would change, and I chose to stay still. The conversation flowed on perfectly. No one paused. No one noticed the space that opened when I didn't speak. People nodded, smiled lightly, added a few details to the plan. I sat down in my familiar chair, placed my hands on the table like I always did. That smoothness was what made me feel cold. Not because I was ignored, but because it happened so easily. As if the absence of my voice had already been accounted for. As if my silence were a necessary part of keeping everything on rhythm. That was when I understood something I had never named before. My silence wasn't just accepted, it was expected. There are moments when you don't realize you've been pushed outside, until the door has already closed. If it were you, what would you do? Would you knock? Or would you stand still to make sure you weren't bothering anyone? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes just writing "me too" is enough. That night, I did everything as usual. I cleaned up, turned off the lights, wished everyone good night. I didn't make any noise, but when I lay down, the familiar ceiling suddenly felt distant. I began to understand that silence isn't free. It has weight and the cost of it. I had only just touched the edge. I had lived for a long time believing I was sacrificing for my family, not in a grand way, but through small concessions repeated every day until they became invisible. I was proud of being the one who didn't make things complicated. I believed that if everything ran smoothly, if no one felt uncomfortable because of me, that was a sign of maturity. I thought I was helping keep the family standing, like a small nail holding a picture frame straight on the wall, unnoticed, but everything tilts without it. That belief only began to crack in a very ordinary moment. We were talking about something minor, nothing tense. I was standing by the counter, holding a dish towel, listening as everyone talked. When someone hesitated, I moved forward out of habit, ready to smooth things over, and then a sentence slipped out, light and unintentional. "It's fine. We're used to it this way." No one looked at me when it was said. No one laughed. The sentence passed like a neutral observation, harmless enough not to sound cruel. But I froze. Used to it. Not "Lydia helps." Not "Lydia agrees." Just a habit. In that moment, I understood something I had never allowed myself to think before. No one had asked me to sacrifice. No one had sat me down and told me it was my responsibility. They were simply used to me doing it. So used to it that it no longer looked like a choice, but like the way things naturally worked. I turned back toward myself, very slowly. I had tied my value to how smoothly things went for other people. I had confused sacrifice with being needed. I had confused not making things complicated with having a place. That realization didn't make me angry right away. It made me quieter in a different way. For the first time, that silence wasn't about keeping the peace. It was about listening more closely to what was shifting inside. A very small seed had been planted, not big enough to change anything yet, but enough for me to know I wouldn't be able to go back to how things were. The request came in the most familiar way, on an afternoon that seemed completely ordinary. The voice wasn't raised or lowered, carrying the assumption that the answer was already settled. I listened, and my old reflex rose immediately, a nod almost without thought, the phrase, "I'll take care of it," waiting on my tongue. I was used to that rhythm. Hear it, accept it, rearrange my life to fit someone else's needs. But this time, something slowed me down. Not a grand resolve, not a sudden burst of courage. Just a few, very small seconds, longer than usual. I looked down at my hands and noticed they were lightly clenched together. In that pause, I could hear my breathing clearly. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't rush to fill the silence. "Give me some time to think," I said. My voice was even, neither asking permission nor pushing back, just a sentence standing there, unhurried, unforced. The air in the room changed immediately. No one reacted strongly. There were no accusations, just a slight hesitation, like when a familiar song suddenly slips off beat. Eyes moved between faces more quickly. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else smiled, but the smile didn't reach their eyes. I felt the discomfort spread, not loudly but clearly, not because the request had been refused, but because the familiar order had been briefly suspended. I stood there with that feeling, my heart beating faster than I expected. A part of me wanted to fix it right away, to say something more so everything would slide back into place. But I didn't. I left my words where they were. For the first time, I allowed them to have their own weight. When the conversation moved on, I stepped back slightly, like someone who had just edged out of a fast-moving current. I didn't know where this would lead. I only knew that in that moment, a small door had opened, and I had stood close enough to see it. After that, nothing exploded the way I had feared. No one got angry. No one raised their voice. My family's reaction was a strange kind of confusion, like when someone walks into a familiar room and notices an object has been moved. I saw their eyes linger on me longer than usual, not sharp, just assessing. I was looked at differently, not as a troublemaker, but as someone who had disrupted a habit. In the conversations that followed, I noticed how that small change spread in very concrete ways. When something needed to be handled, eyes still drifted toward me out of reflex, then paused. There was a brief gap, long enough for someone to clear their throat, long enough for another person to suggest a different option. I thought of a familiar chair being pulled out of the room. No one trips immediately, but everyone has to slow down to find a new place to sit. That moment made me realize how tightly my role had been tied to convenience. Not because I was the best at it, but because I was always willing. I turned back toward myself, not to blame, but to understand. I had built my value on making things easier for other people. When that ease disappeared, what surfaced wasn't anger. It was uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, I could finally see the place I had been occupying all along. You might be wondering, too, what happens when the one who always gives way decides to stand still? How do you think a family reacts? Leave your thoughts. Sometimes just saying what you're thinking is enough to feel lighter. And if you see yourself somewhere in this story, stay with me. I didn't offer long explanations. I didn't argue my case. I just held my silence in a new way. Not to smooth things over, but to respect the choice I had just made. This time, the silence was mine, and I accepted that it would carry consequences. Nothing collapsed after that. No doors were slammed shut. No one pulled me aside for an apology, and no one revisited the past as if it needed explaining. Everything continued, slow and familiar, like a road without sharp turns, just a slight change of lanes. I realized I had been waiting for something bigger, a clearer reaction, as if change only mattered when it came with drama. But no one was punished. No one was cast as the wrong one. And in that quiet, I understood something that made me stop for a long time. I didn't need a loud ending to know I was on the right path. The pivotal moment didn't come from a sharp remark or a confrontation. It came when I realized that setting boundaries doesn't have to break anything. Sometimes it simply reveals the true shape of relationships as they already are. I started setting very small boundaries, not as a declaration, just quiet choices, not rearranging my schedule at the last minute, not replying immediately to messages that assumed I would say yes, not agreeing just because I was afraid someone would be disappointed. It all sounded simple, but every time I did it, I felt a small wave rise in my chest. Guilt. Clear and very real. I was used to seeing myself as useful. When I stopped, a sense of uselessness slipped in faster than I expected. I wondered if I was being selfish, if I was hurting someone by no longer being as available as before. Those questions didn't disappear right away. I didn't try to chase them off. I learned how to sit with that feeling, like sitting with a light rain, not running from it, not standing there to endure it, just walking a little more slowly. No one gave me the validation I used to think I needed. And because of that, I began to realize that the most important validation doesn't come from outside. It comes in the moment I sit down, alone, and see that I no longer have to ask permission to exist in my own way. The change didn't arrive through an argument or a dramatic break. It came very slowly, like when a chair in the living room gets moved to another corner and no one says anything. A relationship in my family grew more distant in a way that was hard to name. There were no clear signs, just fewer check-ins, fewer favors, fewer while you're at it requests I used to hear all the time. I noticed it late one night, when the house was quiet and the heater hummed steadily in the background. I set my phone on the nightstand and waited, an old habit I hadn't let go of yet. No messages, no calls. The dark screen reflected my face faintly, like a closed window. That silence was different from before. It didn't come with urgency. It didn't make me jump up to check again. I just sat there for a long time, noticing how strangely quiet my phone was. And in that moment, I didn't panic. I hurt, but I didn't panic. The hurt wasn't sharp or stabbing. It was a dull ache, just enough to tell me I was losing something. And then a realization appeared, slowly and clearly enough that I couldn't avoid it. Some relationships only exist when I'm willing to disappear inside them. When I stopped automatically filling the gaps, the connection loosened, like a rope that had gotten used to carrying weight from one side. I turned back toward myself, this time not to blame, but to understand. I used to fear loss more than I feared disappearing. I chose to hold on to relationships by making myself smaller, believing that was safety. But that night, in that quiet room, I saw the cost of that safety. It didn't erase me all at once. It just faded me, little by little. I put my phone down, turned off the light, and lay still in the dark. Something was shifting. I didn't know what shape it would take. I only knew that from that moment on, I began living differently. I didn't become tougher in the way people usually imagine. I didn't speak louder, didn't argue harshly, didn't lay down rules that made the room feel smaller. What changed was clarity. A thin but decisive line around what I could do and what I would no longer do. I arrived on time and left on time. I answered when there was a question, but I didn't fill the empty space with my familiar rush. I listened, but I didn't automatically pick up the work no one had claimed. One afternoon, as we sat around the kitchen table with sunlight slanting through the curtains, someone looked at me a little longer than usual and said, almost casually, "You've been different lately." The words weren't a scolding and weren't praise. They hung in the middle of the room, light as dust. I smiled. Not the soothing smile that helps everything move along, but a smile that stayed where it was with no need to explain. In that moment, I realized I no longer felt the urge to prove anything. I didn't need to recount my journey, didn't need to justify the small choices I had put in place. I understood that my change wasn't a statement. It was an outcome. It came from evenings when I put my phone down earlier, from letting unfinished tasks wait until tomorrow, from staying with discomfort instead of trying to shut it down. I began to be present in my own life in very ordinary ways. I cooked dinner more slowly, noticed the way the onions browned, listened to the gentle bubbling of the pot. I walked around the neighborhood after meals, noticing how similar the houses were and how different the pockets of light looked. I slept more deeply, not because everything was fixed, but because I no longer stayed awake guarding other people's empty spaces. There was no need for a big ending, no need for anyone's approval. My change didn't tip the house over, and it didn't make people leave. It simply made me stand a little straighter in that familiar space. And when I stood straighter, I realized I wasn't taking up more room. I was just no longer shrinking. I didn't beat anyone in this story. No one lost, so I could stand up and take the prize. The only thing I did was stop leaving myself behind. I understood that on very ordinary mornings, making coffee and listening to the steady drip of water, when the kitchen was still empty and I was fully there. Boundaries for me now aren't a wall. They're the shape of respect. Respect for my time, my breath, and the things I can do without turning myself into empty space. I accepted the small losses that came with it. There were distances that didn't get filled back in. Old habits didn't return. I didn't deny the sadness of realizing I was no longer the default support for everything. But that sadness no longer made me panic. It came and went like a cool breeze at the end of the day. I no longer needed to be called good. That label used to keep me safe, but it also kept me in one place for too long. I chose to stay inside my own life, with small, clear choices enough to remind me that I'm living. The story you just heard is a fictional story, inspired by real-life situations and very human experiences. The content was created with the help of AI and edited by a human to offer reflection and educational perspective. It is not meant to encourage imitation. The value of this story, if there is any, is in pausing to look at familiar silences. Silences that kept everything looking fine, but sometimes took more from us than we realized. If there is a gift for you as you close this video, maybe it is this gentle reminder. Listen to the moment you pause, because it holds important information about you. Before you go, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you live right now. Stories like this are often heard after nightfall, when the house is quiet and the heart opens up. If you see yourself anywhere in what I've shared, leave a line. Sometimes just saying, "me too," is enough. Thank you for staying until the end. If this video gave you even a minute of stillness, please hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. We'll keep walking through late nights together, slowly and honestly.